Senator Thomas Wells sat at a corner table in Le Maison, an upscale restaurant in downtown Boston, swirling a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon in his hand. The soft murmur of conversation, the clinking of silverware, and the ambient glow of candlelight formed a serene backdrop for what was supposed to be a routine dinner with his political advisor. Yet, Thomas was miles away from the current discussion about the upcoming elections. His mind wandered back to a time long buried, to Amelia, his wife who had vanished 15 years ago without a trace. Her absence had left a scar that never healed, a wound that never closed. "Senator, are you listening?" His advisor's voice broke through his reverie. Yes, of course," Thomas lied, pushing his thoughts aside, though the weight of his emotions hung heavy in his chest. Just as he turned to refocus on the conversation, he saw her. A waitress moving gracefully between tables, balancing a tray of drinks with practiced ease. But it wasn't her movements that captured his attention. It was her face. It was Amelia, or someone who looked exactly like her. His heart skipped a beat. His hand trembled as he set his wine glass down, eyes following the young woman across the room. The resemblance was undeniable. Same dark, wavy hair, same high cheekbones, and those eyes, deep and piercing, the very shade of green that haunted his dreams. His pulse quickened, and a flood of memories crashed over him. The day she disappeared, the endless search, the futile hope that she might somehow return. "Thomas!" His advisor's voice was distant, a background noise now. Thomas could hardly breathe. He rose from his chair abruptly, nearly knocking the table over. His advisor's startled expression was ignored as Thomas made his way across the restaurant, his gaze locked on the waitress who had just disappeared through the kitchen door. Every rational part of his brain told him this was impossible. Amelia was gone. He had accepted it, but his heart screamed otherwise. Bursting through the kitchen doors, he stood there, scanning the bustling staff, trying to catch a glimpse of the woman. After a moment, she emerged, tray in hand. Her face lit up with a polite smile. She stopped when she saw him standing there, confusion flickering across her features. "Can I help you, sir?" Her voice was soft, but it wasn't Amelia's. Thomas stood frozen, his throat dry. I'm sorry. You remind me of someone." Her brow furrowed slightly. "I get that a lot. My name's Rachel." Rachel. The name struck him like a bucket of cold water. He stepped back, suddenly feeling foolish, a surge of embarrassment mixing with the shock. She wasn't Amelia. Of course she wasn't. But how could someone look so much like her? "I'm sorry," Thomas muttered, backing away. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Rachel gave him an uncertain smile and walked away, leaving Thomas standing there, heart pounding in his chest. He returned to his table, but nothing felt the same. As the rest of the evening blurred into the background, Thomas could think of nothing else but Rachel. Rachel, who looked exactly like his long-lost wife. Later that night, as he lay awake in his bed, his mind raced. The rational part of him knew that Rachel was just an eerie coincidence. But the resemblance was too uncanny. Was it possible? Could she somehow be connected to Amelia? Or had grief and longing finally clouded his judgment? Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: obsession. He had to know more. The next morning, Thomas Wells couldn't shake the image of Rachel Carter from his mind. Sitting in his office, surrounded by files and political briefings, he found himself distracted, his thoughts always returning to her face. The face that was Amelia's but wasn't. His hands rested idly on his desk, while his advisor's voice droned on about campaign strategies. He was barely listening. "You look tired, Thomas," said his advisor, pausing mid-sentence. Thomas blinked, forcing himself to engage. "Yeah, just didn't sleep much," he replied, waving it off. But as soon as he was alone, he opened his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment. He typed in the name, Rachel Carter. His heart pounded as he hit search. Was he really doing this? Was he actually investigating a woman who was just doing her job? Yet, something deep inside him urged him on, the same nagging voice that had haunted him for years, the voice that never accepted Amelia's disappearance. The results were minimal. Rachel's name came up in local listings, a waitress at Le Maison for the past 5 years. Nothing unusual, no red flags. Thomas scrolled through public records. No criminal history, no suspicious activity. But something caught his eye. Asterisk adopted star. Rachel Carter had been adopted when she was a young child. That detail made him pause. He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen, the gears in his mind turning. An orphan? Adopted? Where had she come from? Who were her real parents? The questions swirled faster than he could process. Was it possible that Rachel was somehow connected to Amelia? The very idea seemed ridiculous, but the coincidence was too powerful to ignore. Thomas stood abruptly and grabbed his coat, leaving the office without a word. His driver, a stoic man named Marcus, didn't question the sudden departure as Thomas slid into the back seat of the black sedan. "Take me to Lume's zone," he ordered. Marcus glanced at him through the rearview mirror but said nothing, guiding the car smoothly through the Boston streets. Thomas stared out the window, his mind racing. This was absurd. He knew that. And yet, he felt compelled, no, driven, to find out more. When they arrived, the restaurant was quiet, still in its midday lull. Thomas stepped inside, immediately greeted by the maitre d'. "Senator Wells," the man said, clearly surprised to see him. "Back so soon? Can I get you a table?" "I'm not here to eat," Thomas said, his voice sharper than he intended. "Is Rachel Carter working today?" The maitre d' hesitated, eyebrows raised in confusion. "I believe she's in the back. Is there something I can? I just need to talk to her." The man's polite smile faltered, but he nodded. One moment, Thomas paced the floor as he waited, his heart racing with anticipation. This was madness. He wasn't even sure what he'd say to her. But when Rachel emerged from the back, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression was one of cautious curiosity. "Senator Wells," she greeted him, her voice even, but there was a hint of unease in her eyes. "You're back. Is there something wrong?" Thomas swallowed, his mind scrambling for a rational explanation for his sudden reappearance. I just wanted to apologize for yesterday. I must have startled you." Rachel's brow furrowed slightly. "It's fine, really. I understand. People say I look like someone they know all the time, but this wasn't just some vague resemblance." Thomas couldn't let it go. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You said you were adopted?" Her expression stiffened, clearly surprised by the personal question. "Yes. Why do you ask?" Thomas felt a knot tighten in his chest. "I lost someone years ago. Someone important. And I just can't get over how much you look like her." Rachel stared at him, the confusion deepening in her eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss, but I don't know what you're getting at, Senator." Thomas rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the weight of his obsession. Where were you before you were adopted?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she crossed her arms defensively. "I don't really know. I was in the system as far back as I can remember. Why are you asking me these things?" Thomas stepped back, realizing how irrational he sounded. He was pushing too hard, letting his emotions cloud his judgment. "I'm sorry. It's just that you remind me so much of her." His voice softened. "It's like seeing a ghost." Rachel's posture relaxed slightly, though the wariness didn't fade from her face. "I wish I could help, but I don't know anything about my biological parents. I've never looked into it." Thomas nodded, retreating. He had no right to pry, no justification for the invasive questions. But as he walked out of the restaurant, something inside him had shifted. Her past was a mystery, just like Amelia's disappearance. And that connection, flimsy as it was, gnawed at him. Back in the car, he took out his phone, hesitating for a moment before making a call. "Tommy," a gruff voice answered after the first ring. "Jeff," Thomas said, his voice low, "I need a favor. I need you to look into someone for me. A girl. Rachel Carter. She was adopted, and I need to know where she came from." There was a pause on the other end. "Senator, you sure about this? It doesn't sound like a great idea." "I don't care," Thomas replied, more forcefully than he intended. "I need to know." After a long silence, Jeff finally answered. "All right, I'll see what I can dig up." As the call ended, Thomas stared out the window, his mind still racing. If there was even a chance, No matter how small, that Rachel was somehow linked to Amelia, he had to find out. He couldn't let this go, not now. Not after all these years of unanswered questions. And so, the investigation began. The next few days passed in a haze for Senator Thomas Wells. He carried on with his duties, attending meetings, shaking hands, and giving speeches. But beneath the polished facade of his public life, his mind churned relentlessly with one singular focus: Rachel Carter. His old friend Jeff had started digging into her background, but the wait for answers was excruciating. Thomas found himself constantly checking his phone, waiting for updates, his anxiety growing with each passing hour. On the third evening, as Thomas sat alone in his study, the phone finally rang. The screen lit up with Jeff's name, and his heart raced. He picked up immediately, barely allowing the call to ring. "Jeff?" Thomas's voice was strained, the anticipation palpable. "I've got something for you." Jeff's voice came through, steady and calm. "But you're not going to like it." Thomas swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the phone. "Just tell me." Jeff exhaled slowly, as though weighing the gravity of his words. "I looked into Rachel Carter's adoption records. Officially, she was adopted when she was around 3 years old. But there are inconsistencies, gaps in the paperwork. Her records before the adoption are basically non-existent." Thomas felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean, non-existent?" "I mean," Jeff continued, "there's almost nothing about where she came from before she entered the system. It's like she just appeared out of nowhere. No birth certificate, no medical records. Nothing that would tie her to any family before the adoption. The only thing I could find was an incomplete death certificate for a woman who died around the same time Rachel appeared in the system. The name on the certificate? Amelia Wells." For a moment, Thomas couldn't breathe. His mind struggled to process what Jeff had just said. What did you just say?" His voice cracked. Jeff hesitated. "I know how it sounds, but I cross-checked everything. The death certificate is from a hospital just outside of Boston. Amelia was listed as deceased, but the file was never fully closed. It's like they started the paperwork and then stopped. No burial records, no official cause of death. It just ends there." Thomas's world began to spin. The room felt too small, the walls too close. He stood abruptly, pacing the study in disbelief. "So you're telling me that my wife's death was never properly recorded? That she might not even be dead?" "I don't know, Thomas," Jeff said cautiously. "All I know is there's a lot of missing information. And it gets weirder. The hospital where the certificate was issued, it's been closed for over a decade. The records are spotty, but there are rumors about a few shady practices going on before it shut down. Cover-ups, falsified reports, that kind of thing." Thomas stopped pacing, gripping the back of his chair to steady himself. His mind reeled. 15 years. 15 years he had believed Amelia was gone. But now there was a chance she had been alive when the world thought she was dead. And Rachel? Could Rachel somehow be linked to all of this? "I need to know more," Thomas said, his voice shaking with a mix of desperation and anger. "I need you to find out everything about that hospital. And if my wife was there, if she was a patient, I need to know what happened." "Thomas, I think you need to slow down," Jeff warned. "We're walking a fine line here. If you dig too deep, you might uncover things that are better left buried." "I don't care," Thomas snapped. "I need answers, Jeff. I've lived in the dark for too long." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Jeff finally responded. "All right, I'll keep digging. But be careful, Thomas. You don't know who might be watching." After hanging up, Thomas sat heavily in his chair, his mind racing. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and tried to make sense of the chaos unraveling before him. Amelia's death certificate had never been completed. Rachel had appeared in the adoption system around the same time. No history, no trace of a family. Just gone, like a ghost from the past. But there was one more step. If the hospital had been involved in something illegal, something hidden, then there had to be more. Thomas couldn't stop now. He needed to confront the possibility, as terrifying as it was. The thought that his wife had been the victim of a conspiracy, that she might still be out there somewhere, filled him with equal parts hope and dread. The next day, after a sleepless night, Thomas took a bold step. He visited the Boston Archives, a vast building filled with rows of dusty records, each shelf holding decades of forgotten history. He needed to see the death certificate for himself. A tired-looking clerk brought him the file, a yellowed piece of paper with faded ink. Thomas's hands shook as he read the details. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. It belonged to an old acquaintance of his, Dr. Richard Hawthorne, a well-known physician who had been at the center of several scandals involving malpractice. A wave of nausea hit Thomas. He remembered Hawthorne from his early days in politics. They had crossed paths during a public health initiative. There had been whispers of Hawthorne's involvement in unethical practices, but nothing had ever stuck. He had disappeared from the public eye years ago, but now, it seemed, he might have played a role in Amelia's disappearance. Suddenly, a deep, sickening suspicion began to form in Thomas's mind. Was it possible that someone had orchestrated Amelia's disappearance to hurt him politically? He had made many enemies in his rise to power. Could they have staged her death, taken her from him, to weaken him, to distract him? As he left the archives, clutching the incomplete death certificate, Thomas knew what his next move had to be. He needed to find Hawthorne. If anyone knew the truth about Amelia, it was him. But as he walked back to his car, the weight of the situation bore down on him. For years, he had lived in the shadow of grief, convinced that Amelia was lost forever. Now, with the possibility that she had been alive, maybe still was, he felt the world around him shift. Nothing was certain anymore, not even the past. And as for Rachel, the more Thomas uncovered, the more he began to believe she was the key to everything. The truth lay somewhere in her past. He just had to find it. Thomas Wells could barely focus on the drive to Rachel's apartment. His knuckles were white as they gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing with the implications of everything he had learned. The incomplete death certificate, the shady hospital records, the suspicion that Amelia might have been part of something far darker than he ever imagined. And now, the most unsettling question of all, was Rachel Carter his daughter? It was absurd, impossible, but the facts kept pointing him in that direction. The timing of Rachel's adoption, her uncanny resemblance to Amelia, the mysterious gaps in her past. The more Thomas thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. If Rachel had been born just before Amelia disappeared, it was almost too much to take in. He parked a block away from Rachel's modest apartment building, his heart hammering in his chest. He had no plan. He hadn't rehearsed what he would say, how he would approach this. All he knew was that he needed to see her again, needed answers. Thomas walked up the cracked stone steps of the building, barely noticing the autumn chill in the air. His thoughts were entirely consumed by the possibility that he was about to confront a truth he had never expected to find. When he reached her door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorbell. What if he was wrong? What if this was just a cruel twist of fate, and Rachel was nothing more than an innocent bystander in the tragedy of his life? Or worse, what if he was right? Before he could overthink it, he pressed the button. The soft chime echoed from inside, and after a moment, he heard footsteps approaching the door. It swung open, revealing Rachel, dressed casually in a worn sweater, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw him standing there. "Senator Wells," she said, her voice tinged with confusion. "What are you doing here?" Thomas struggled to find his words, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Rachel, I need to talk to you. Can I come in?" Rachel hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. But after a tense pause, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with simple furniture and warm lighting. It was a stark contrast to the opulence Thomas was used to, but it suited her. As he stepped inside, Thomas felt a strange mix of emotions. He was here to confront the possibility that Rachel was connected to his missing wife, but there was also something deeply unsettling about intruding into her personal life like this. She was still a stranger to him, after all. Rachel motioned for him to sit, and they both settled into chairs on opposite sides of the small living room. An awkward silence stretched between them. "What's going on?" Rachel asked finally, her tone cautious but not unkind. "This is strange. Yesterday you were asking me all these questions, and now you're here." in my apartment. What's this really about? Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He took a deep breath, knowing there was no easy way to say what he needed to say. Rachel, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you might sound insane, but I have reason to believe that you might be connected to someone from my past. Someone very important to me. Rachel's brow furrowed in confusion. What are you talking about? You think I'm connected to your wife? The woman you said I reminded you of? Thomas nodded, his throat tight. Yes, I know how this must sound, but the resemblance isn't the only thing. I've been looking into your past, your adoption, and there are things that don't add up. Records missing. Your life before the adoption is a blank slate. And his voice wavered as he spoke the next words. There's a chance that you might be my daughter. Rachel froze, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her mind trying to process the enormity of what he was saying. What? She whispered, shaking her head. That's not possible. My parents, they adopted me when I was 3. I don't know anything about my biological family. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. I know how crazy this sounds, but there are too many coincidences, too many things that line up. My wife, Amelia, she disappeared 15 years ago, right around the time you would have been born. And the circumstances of her death, the way it was reported, it doesn't make sense. She was pregnant when she disappeared, Rachel. Rachel stood abruptly, pacing the small room as she processed the information. No, this can't be right, she muttered, more to herself than to Thomas. I don't remember anything before I was adopted. And my parents, they never said anything about this. Thomas watched her, his heart aching at the turmoil he had thrown her into. He had felt the same way, lost, confused, and desperate for answers, ever since Amelia had vanished. And now, he was dragging Rachel into that same dark abyss of doubt and uncertainty. Look, Thomas said, standing as well, I don't expect you to just believe me, but I need to know the truth, and I think you deserve to know it too. We can do a DNA test. It's the only way to be sure. Rachel stopped pacing, turning to face him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fear. A DNA test? You think that's going to prove something? What if you're wrong? What if I'm just some random girl who looks like your wife? Thomas swallowed hard, stepping closer to her. I've spent 15 years wondering what happened to Amelia. 15 years without answers. I'm not saying this is definite, but if there's even the smallest chance, we owe it to ourselves to find out. Don't you want to know who you really are? Rachel's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, Thomas saw the conflict in her eyes. She didn't want to believe him, didn't want to get pulled into whatever mystery he was unraveling. But there was also a part of her, deep down, that wanted the answers he was offering. After what felt like an eternity, Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. All right, she said softly. All right, we'll do the test. But I need you to understand something. This is all I've ever known. If what you're saying is true, it could change everything for me. Thomas nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. I know, and I'm sorry to put you through this, but I couldn't walk away, not after everything I've uncovered. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the truth hanging heavy between them. Rachel, still reeling from the revelation, glanced at Thomas with a mix of fear and hope. If it turns out you're right, she said slowly, what does that mean for me? What does it mean for you? Thomas didn't have an answer. He wasn't even sure he wanted to know. But he knew one thing. After all these years of living in the shadow of Amelia's disappearance, he was closer than ever to finding the truth. And now, Rachel was at the heart of it. We'll figure it out, Thomas said quietly. Together. Rachel nodded, though the uncertainty in her eyes remained. As Thomas left her apartment that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life, and hers, was about to change forever. The truth, whatever it was finally within reach. But with it came the realization that some truths are more dangerous than the lies they replace. The days after the meeting with Rachel felt like a blur for Thomas Wells. He had sent the DNA samples for testing immediately, and now all he could do was wait. The uncertainty gnawed at him, a constant, gnawing sensation that made it impossible to focus on anything else. Each night, he lay awake, his mind reeling with the possibilities. What if Rachel was his daughter? What if Amelia had been alive when everyone believed she was dead? But beneath all the questions, another thought haunted him. Why? Why would someone stage Amelia's death? And if they had, why had they kept Rachel hidden? The more he tried to make sense of it, the more convinced he became that this was no accident. This had been deliberate, planned, and if that was true, someone had to be responsible. Someone with power, influence, and the resources to pull off something this big. It wasn't until the DNA results came back, though, that everything truly began to unravel. Thomas sat in his office when the call came through. The air felt thick with tension as he listened to the lab technician's voice, confirming what he had both feared and hoped for. The test was positive. Rachel was his biological daughter. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as the weight of the revelation settled over him. Rachel was his daughter. Amelia had been pregnant when she disappeared, just as he had thought, and somehow, their child had been lost in the system, adopted by strangers. But the bigger question remained. Where was Amelia? Thomas ended the call and immediately dialed Jeff. "I've got the results," Thomas said, his voice tight. "Rachel's my daughter." There was a pause on the other end. "Jesus, Thomas. So it's true. What now?" "I need to know who's behind this," Thomas said firmly. "I need to know what happened to Amelia." "I've been digging deeper into that hospital," Jeff replied, his tone serious. "It's bad, Thomas. I found some old records, people who worked there before it shut down. And I've uncovered something I didn't expect." Thomas gripped the phone tighter. "What is it?" "It looks like the hospital was being used for more than just medical care," Jeff explained. "There's evidence of political influence, high-ranking officials using it as a front to make people disappear. People who were inconvenient for certain political players." Thomas's stomach churned. He had feared corruption, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. "So they faked Amelia's death to get to me? To destroy me politically?" "I think so," Jeff said quietly. "You were rising fast back then. You had a lot of enemies, and they couldn't touch you directly, but they could take someone you loved. By staging Amelia's death, they sent you into a tailspin, emotionally, politically, and it worked." Thomas stood abruptly, pacing his office. He remembered how shattered he had been after Amelia's disappearance, how his focus had shifted from his career to the endless search for her. He had almost walked away from politics altogether. His enemies had succeeded in derailing him. Who was behind it? Thomas demanded, his voice sharp with anger. "I'm still working on that," Jeff said, "but I've got a few leads. One name that keeps coming up is Martin Hale." Thomas froze. The name was all too familiar. Hale had been one of his fiercest rivals, ruthless politician who would stop at nothing to gain power. They had clashed repeatedly over the years, and Hale had always seemed to relish any opportunity to undermine Thomas. "Hale?" Thomas repeated, his mind racing. "You think he's involved?" "I don't have proof yet," Jeff cautioned, "but everything points in that direction." Hale had the motive and the means. He could have pulled the strings to make it all happen. Thomas felt a surge of rage boiling in his chest. Hale had ruined his life, taken his wife, stolen his daughter, and shattered his family. And now, after all these years, the truth was finally surfacing. "I'm going to confront him," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. "Thomas, wait." Jeff started to protest, but Thomas had already hung up the phone. The drive to Hale's estate was a blur. Thomas's hands clenched the steering wheel as he navigated the winding roads, his mind consumed by thoughts of revenge. He had spent years mourning Amelia, believing she was dead, and all the while, Hale had been living comfortably, his career thriving while Thomas had struggled to rebuild his. When he arrived at the grand estate, the gates stood open, as if mocking him. He drove up the long, tree-lined driveway, parking his car near the entrance. The house loomed ahead, a symbol of everything Hale had taken from him. Thomas approached the door, his heart pounding. He rang the bell, his jaw clenched as he prepared for the confrontation. Moments later, the door opened, and there stood Martin Hale, dressed impeccably as always, his silver hair neatly combed back. "Thomas," Hale said smoothly, his voice oozing with false politeness. "To what do I owe this surprise visit?" Thomas didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Where is Amelia?" he demanded, his voice cold and hard. Hale's smile faltered slightly, though he quickly recovered. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Amelia? Wasn't she your wife? I heard she disappeared." "A terrible tragedy." Thomas stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "Don't play games with me, Hale. I know you had something to do with it. I know about the hospital. I know about Rachel." Hale's eyes darkened, the mask of politeness slipping. "You've been digging where you shouldn't, Thomas. You don't know what you're getting into." "I know exactly what I'm getting into," Thomas shot back. "You took everything from me. My wife, my child, everything. And I'm going to expose you for what you did." Hale's expression hardened. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? But you're just a pawn, Thomas. Always have been. You weren't strong enough to play the game, so we made sure you couldn't." Thomas's rage boiled over. "You ruined my life. My family." "Your family?" Hale interrupted, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your wife was collateral damage. You were the target. And if you think you can just waltz in here and threaten me, you're sorely mistaken." Thomas's hand twitched, but he stopped himself from lashing out. "This isn't over, Hale. I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done." Hale smirked. "You can try, but you're out of your league." Without another word, Thomas turned and walked away, his mind spinning. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Hale might have had the upper hand once, but the truth was out now. And Thomas wasn't going to stop until he brought down everyone who had been part of the conspiracy. As he drove away from the estate, his phone buzzed with a message from Jeff. Asterisk, "I've got a lead on where Amelia might be." Asterisk. Thomas stared at the screen, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The truth was finally within reach. But as he headed toward the next chapter in this nightmare, he knew one thing for sure. The closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it would become. Thomas Wells sat in his dimly lit office, the weight of the world pressing down on him. His hands rested on his desk, unmoving, as the message from Jeff burned in his mind. Asterisk, "I've got a lead on where Amelia might be." Asterisk, he had waited years for this moment. But now that it was here, a heavy sense of dread gnawed at him. The truth he had been chasing for so long was finally within reach. But what would it cost him to uncover it? The faint glow of his computer screen illuminated the dark room, casting shadows that danced across the walls. On it, news headlines flashed about his political campaign, his popularity surging, a critical vote looming on the horizon. His career, something he had clawed his way back to after Amelia's disappearance, was on the cusp of reaching new heights. But now, with everything that had come to light, he stood at a dangerous crossroads. He could expose Hale, the conspiracy, and everything that had been done to his family. But doing so would destroy everything he had built. The scandal would obliterate his political career, drag his family's name through the mud, and turn Rachel's life upside down. The public would demand answers. The media would devour them. Every detail of Amelia's disappearance, Rachel's adoption, and his connection to it all would be plastered across headlines for months. And then there was Rachel herself. Since discovering she was his daughter, Rachel had kept her distance, trying to process the whirlwind of revelations that had shattered her understanding of her own life. Thomas hadn't pressed her for more contact. He knew she needed time. But the thought of dragging her into a public spectacle made his stomach turn. She had no idea who her real mother was, what forces had conspired to tear them apart. Could he really put her through that? A soft knock on the door pulled Thomas from his thoughts. He glanced up as his advisor, Lisa, stepped into the room. Her face was tense, concern etched in every line. "Senator, you look like hell," she said bluntly, closing the door behind her. "Is everything okay?" Thomas sighed, rubbing his temples. "No, Lisa, everything is far from okay." She sat across from him, her sharp eyes studying him carefully. "Is this about the Hale situation? You've been acting off ever since you started digging into your wife's disappearance again." Thomas leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "It's more than that." I found out things I wasn't ready for. There's more to Amelia's disappearance than I ever imagined. Lisa didn't flinch. She had been with Thomas long enough to know how to navigate his moods. So what are you going to do? If you have evidence of something, now's the time to bring it forward. Hale's dangerous, but if we hit him hard enough, we can take him down. Thomas shook his head, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. It's not that simple. If I expose Hale, this will become a public spectacle. Rachel, my daughter. His voice cracked slightly. She doesn't even know the full truth yet. I don't know if I can put her through that. Lisa's eyes softened for a moment, the hard political strategist giving way to the woman who had seen Thomas at his lowest. Look, I get it. You're trying to protect her. But Hale isn't going to just sit back and let you live your life. He'll come after you again. Harder this time. You can't just sweep this under the rug. Thomas clenched his fists, feeling torn between two impossible choices. What if I don't expose him? What if I walk away from this? Let him think I don't know the full story and protect my family instead? Lisa narrowed her eyes. You can't be serious. You're willing to let the man who destroyed your life get away with it? After all he's done to you? Thomas's jaw tightened, his voice strained. What if going after him means losing Rachel? Losing my career? Everything I've worked for? Everything I've fought to rebuild after Amelia disappeared? Would it even be worth it? The question hung in the air, a heavy, uncomfortable truth neither of them could answer easily. Lisa sat back, folding her arms across her chest. This isn't just about your career, Thomas. This is about what's right. If you let Hale get away with this, how will you live with yourself? What happens the next time he tries to ruin someone's life? Thomas dropped his head into his hands, feeling the pressure of years of unresolved grief and anger finally come to a head. The moral dilemma twisted inside him like a knife. He could pursue justice, but at the cost of his own family's peace. Or he could protect Rachel, protect his legacy, and let the past stay buried. The shrill ring of his phone broke the silence. It was Jeff. Thomas hesitated for a moment before answering. Jeff? I've got more, Jeff said without preamble, his voice filled with urgency. I found Amelia. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. What? She's alive, Jeff continued, his voice thick with emotion. I've confirmed it. She's been living under an alias in a remote part of the country. She's been in hiding for all these years. Thomas felt the world spin around him. Amelia? Alive? After all these years of believing she was gone, the thought was almost too much to bear. Why didn't she come back? Why didn't she reach out? I don't have the full story yet, Jeff replied, but it looks like she was being threatened. Hale's people forced her into hiding, made her disappear so you wouldn't find her. Thomas sank into his chair, his mind reeling. Amelia had been alive this whole time, and Rachel had grown up without her mother, without knowing the truth. The anger inside him boiled over, but so did the crushing guilt. He had mourned her, moved on, even as she had been out there, somewhere, living in fear. Where is she? Thomas finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sending you the address now, Jeff said. But, Thomas, you need to be prepared. She's been through a lot. This won't be easy. Thomas hung up the phone, staring blankly at the screen as the address appeared. Amelia was alive. Rachel was his daughter. And everything he thought he knew about the last 15 years had been a lie. Lisa watched him carefully, her voice softer now. You found her, didn't you? Thomas nodded, still in shock. She's alive. Amelia, she's alive. Lisa exhaled, shaking her head in disbelief. What are you going to do now? Thomas looked at her, his mind still clouded with confusion and pain. I don't know. The truth was, he was at a crossroads once again. He could go to Amelia, bring her back into his life, and together they could face the storm that would come with exposing Hale. But that meant sacrificing everything. His career, Rachel's peace, and whatever hope he had of living a normal life again. Or he could walk away, protect Rachel, keep the truth buried, and let the past stay where it belonged, in the shadows. The moral dilemma gnawed at him, deeper now than ever before. Was justice worth the cost of his family's future? Could he live with himself if he let the man who had torn his life apart go unpunished? As he sat in the quiet of his office, Thomas realized that whatever choice he made, it would change his life and Rachel's forever. And no matter which path he chose, there would be no turning back. The truth was out there, waiting for him. But was he ready to face it? Thomas Wells drove through the winding country roads with a heaviness in his chest. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the weight of the impending confrontation suffocating him. He had the address Jeff provided memorized, though he barely needed it. Every mile closer he drove, the more his heart pounded with a mixture of anticipation, fear, and anger. Amelia was alive. Alive. The thought replayed in his mind like a broken record. After 15 years of grief and confusion, after believing he had lost the love of his life forever, she was out there. But the question that consumed him now was, why hadn't she come back? Why had she stayed away, left him to believe she was dead, while Rachel grew up without knowing her true parents? As the car turned onto a narrow gravel road, the headlights illuminated an old, secluded cabin at the end of the path. His pulse quickened. This was it. The truth was waiting inside that cabin, and with it, the confrontation that would change everything. He parked the car, the engine still humming as he sat in silence for a moment. His thoughts raced. Was she expecting him? Was she afraid of him? He had no idea what he was about to face, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. With a deep breath, he killed the engine and stepped out into the cold night air. The cabin was small, worn from years of neglect, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. It looked like the kind of place someone would hide if they didn't want to be found. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door, every step feeling heavier than the last. His hand hovered over the door, hesitating. Was he ready for this? He had spent years imagining what he would say to Amelia if she ever came back, but now, standing at the threshold, he wasn't sure he had the strength. Finally, he knocked. The sound echoed through the stillness of the night, and for a moment, there was no response. Thomas's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. What if she wasn't here? What if it was a mistake? But then, he heard soft footsteps from inside. The door creaked open, revealing a woman standing in the dim light of the cabin's interior. Thomas's breath caught in his chest. It was her, Amelia. She looked different, older, worn by the years of hiding, her face etched with lines of fear and sorrow. But it was undeniably her, the woman he had loved, the woman he had grieved for, the woman who had disappeared from his life without explanation. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, staring at each other, the weight of 15 years pressing down on them both. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't think you'd find me." His throat tightened. "Amelia." He could barely get the words out. "Why? Why didn't you come back? Why did you let me think you were dead?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't move, didn't invite him in. She just stood there, gripping the doorframe as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. It wasn't safe. Her voice broke, and she covered her mouth, trying to steady herself. "I had no choice." Thomas felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, though it was laced with the agony of loss. "No choice? I spent 15 years thinking you were gone. I buried you, Amelia. I grieved for you. How could you do this to me? To us?" Amelia's face crumpled, and for the first time, she stepped back, letting the door swing open as she turned away. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You weren't supposed to find me." Thomas followed her inside, the cold air of the cabin wrapping around him as he stepped into the dimly lit room. It was sparse, almost barren, with only the essentials: a table, a chair, and a small bed in the corner. She had been living in hiding, isolated from the world, from him, from Rachel. "I need to understand," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Tell me why. Tell me everything." Amelia sat down slowly at the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. She didn't meet his gaze, but she began to speak, her voice raw with pain. "After I found out I was pregnant, things started to happen. I noticed people following me, watching me. It wasn't safe anymore, Thomas. They were after me, and I didn't know who to trust. Thomas's fists clenched at his sides. Who was after you? Who did this? Your enemies, Thomas, Amelia said softly, her eyes filled with sorrow. Hale. He orchestrated everything. They knew they couldn't get to you directly, so they came after me. They made me disappear. Thomas's mind reeled as the pieces of the conspiracy began to fall into place. Hale, the man who had ruined his life, who had torn his family apart. It all made sense now. Amelia had been forced into hiding, threatened into silence, all to destroy him. They told me if I didn't disappear, they would kill me and the baby. Amelia continued, her voice trembling. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk Rachel's life. So I ran. They made it look like I was dead, and I had to stay gone. Thomas felt a wave of nausea wash over him. His daughter had grown up without her mother, without him, all because of a political game. He stepped closer, his voice low and strained. Why didn't you tell me? I could have protected you. We could have fought this together. Amelia finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with the weight of the years they had lost. I wanted to, but I couldn't risk it. They were watching everything, waiting for me to make a move. I had to stay hidden. For Rachel. At the mention of Rachel's name, Thomas felt his chest tighten. She doesn't know, does she? Amelia shook her head, her expression pained. No, she doesn't know anything. She's lived her whole life not knowing the truth. I wanted to protect her, but I know I've hurt her. I've hurt both of you. Thomas's hands clenched at his sides. The rage he felt toward Hale, toward the people who had orchestrated this nightmare, burned inside him. But there was also a deep sorrow, a profound grief for the years they had lost, the life they could have had. Rachel knows she's our daughter, Thomas said quietly. I found her. She knows, but she doesn't know why. She doesn't know what happened to you. Amelia's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. You found her? Is she okay? She's confused, hurt, just like me. She's trying to understand how her entire life has been a lie. Amelia covered her face with her hands, the weight of her choices crashing down on her. I don't know how to fix this, Thomas. I don't know if it can be fixed. Thomas sat down beside her, the anger draining out of him, replaced by an overwhelming sense of loss. I don't know either, but we have to try. Rachel deserves to know the truth, and Hale. He has to pay for what he's done. Amelia looked at him, fear flickering in her eyes. If you go after him, it'll destroy everything. Your career, Rachel's life. It'll all be torn apart. Thomas nodded slowly, the weight of the decision heavy in his chest. I know, but I can't let him get away with this. He's taken too much from us already. They sat in silence for a long moment, the past and the future hanging in the balance. Thomas knew that no matter what came next, their lives would never be the same. But for the first time in years, the truth was out, and with it came the hope, however fragile, that they could begin to heal. I'm going to confront him, Thomas said finally, his voice steady. I'm going to make sure he never hurts anyone like this again. Amelia reached for his hand, her fingers trembling. Be careful, Thomas. He's dangerous. Thomas squeezed her hand gently, his resolve hardening. So am I. The next morning, Thomas stood by his car, the early light casting long shadows across the quiet street outside the cabin. The air was crisp, and the cold bit at his skin, but the tension radiating from within was far sharper than the chill in the air. His mind was locked on what had to happen next. He had seen Amelia, spoken with her, touched the pieces of his shattered past that had come back into focus. But now, the truth wasn't just something to be revealed. It was something to be wielded. Thomas clenched his jaw as he thought about Hale. The man had taken everything from him. His wife, his daughter, and years of his life he could never get back. The rage that simmered within him was like a constant flame, steady and unyielding. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. Amelia had gone back into the cabin after their emotional conversation, too fragile to leave her hiding place just yet. She had asked Thomas not to confront Hale, pleaded with him, even. The risks were too high. But Thomas knew that without exposing the man who had orchestrated this, they would never truly be free. Hale had to be stopped. As Thomas drove away from the cabin, heading toward the city, his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was Jeff. "Thomas." Jeff's voice crackled over the speaker, filled with urgency. "I've got news." I dug deeper, and it's worse than we thought. Hale has people everywhere. He's got dirt on half of Washington. He's untouchable unless we bring everything we have at once. Thomas tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." "You need to be careful," Jeff warned. "Hale won't go down quietly. He's ruthless. If he senses you're coming for him, he'll hit back hard. And he won't just target you. Rachel, Amelia, they'll all be in danger." "I know," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "That's why we have to be smart about this. I need you to compile everything we've got. Evidence, records, witnesses. I don't want there to be any way for him to wiggle out of this. I want him finished." Jeff hesitated for a moment before responding, his voice low. "All right, I'll pull it all together. But be ready, Thomas. This is going to get ugly." Thomas hung up and continued driving, his thoughts racing as he plotted his next move. He knew exactly where to find Hale. The man had always been arrogant, always surrounding himself with power and influence. And today, Hale was hosting a private fundraiser at his mansion, a perfect opportunity for Thomas to strike. As he approached Hale's sprawling estate, a knot formed in his stomach. The towering gates, guarded by 2 security officers, loomed ahead like the final threshold between him and the man who had haunted his life for years. The sleek cars of political elites lined the driveway, and Thomas felt a surge of disgust at the thought of all the people who were either unaware or complicit in Hale's crimes. He pulled up to the gate, rolling down his window as one of the guards approached. "Name?" the guard asked, scanning a clipboard. "Senator Thomas Wells," Thomas replied coolly. The guard's eyes flickered with recognition as he nodded and stepped aside. The gate opened slowly, and Thomas drove up the long, winding driveway. He parked near the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. The opulence of Hale's mansion felt obscene to Thomas now, knowing the suffering that had been hidden beneath the surface of this world. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his suit as he headed toward the entrance. As he walked through the grand doors, the sound of polite conversation and clinking glasses filled the air. Wealthy donors, lobbyists, and powerful politicians mingled, unaware that their host was a man capable of unspeakable cruelty. Thomas scanned the room, searching for Hale. His blood boiled as he saw the man standing near the back, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, laughing with a small group of supporters. Hale was the picture of charm and success, his silver hair perfectly styled, his sharp blue eyes scanning the crowd like a predator. Thomas's jaw tightened as he approached, pushing through the crowd with purpose. Hale turned slightly, his smile faltering for just a moment when he saw Thomas. "Senator Wells," Hale greeted, his voice smooth as silk. "I wasn't expecting you here." "I'm sure you weren't," Thomas replied coldly. "We need to talk. Now." Hale raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing as he motioned for the group to disperse. "Excuse us for a moment," he said, and the others quickly stepped away, sensing the tension. Thomas followed Hale to a more private corner of the room, his fists clenched at his sides. The moment they were alone, Thomas's calm facade shattered. "I know what you did," Thomas growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I know you orchestrated Amelia's disappearance. I know you kept her in hiding, threatened her life, our daughter's life, all to destroy me." Hale's expression remained cold, though his eyes glinted with a sharp edge. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Thomas. You've always been prone to conspiracy theories, haven't you?" "It's sad, really." Thomas stepped closer, his face inches from Hale's, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't play games with me, Hale. I have evidence. I've been digging, and I've found more than enough to bring you down. Your days of hiding behind power are over." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Hale's face. He shifted slightly, his hands sliding into his pockets as he considered Thomas's words. "You think you can touch me?" he asked, his voice dropping its smooth veneer. "You think you have enough to take me down?" I've survived men far more powerful than you. If you come after me, you'll regret it. You'll lose everything." "I already lost everything," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "Because of you." Hale's expression hardened, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with tension. "You're a fool, Thomas. You always have been. And if you think you can win this game, you're wrong. I'll bury you." Thomas felt the weight of the years of pain and betrayal crashing over him, but he didn't waver. He had come too far to back down now. "I'm not here to play games. I'm here for justice, and I'm going to make sure everyone sees you for what you really are." Without another word, Thomas turned and walked away, his heart pounding with adrenaline. The confrontation had been brief, but it had been enough. Hale knew the walls were closing in, and for the first time, Thomas saw the cracks in the man's armor. As Thomas left the mansion, he could already feel the storm building behind him. Hale wouldn't go down without a fight, but Thomas wasn't afraid anymore. He had his evidence, he had his resolve, and most importantly, he had the truth. That evening, as the sky darkened and the city's lights twinkled in the distance, Thomas sat down with Jeff to finalize their plan. They would leak the information strategically, making sure the story spread faster than Hale could contain it. Every dirty deal, every hidden conspiracy, every life he had destroyed, it would all come to light. But as Thomas prepared to press send on the first email, his phone buzzed. It was Rachel. "Dad." Her voice was soft, unsure. "I think we need to talk." Thomas's heart swelled with a mix of fear and hope. The battle against Hale was just beginning, but for the first time, there was a chance to rebuild his family. And as the truth began to unravel, Thomas knew one thing for certain. Hale's reign of terror was about to end, and no matter the cost, Thomas was ready to face whatever came next. The truth was out. There was no turning back now. Thomas Wells stood at the edge of the crowded press room, the hum of anticipation buzzing around him. Cameras clicked, reporters whispered to each other, and the tension was palpable. This was it. After weeks of preparation, the truth was finally coming to light. Everything Thomas had uncovered about Martin Hale, the conspiracy, the corruption, the disappearance of Amelia, was about to be made public. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't fear that gripped him anymore. It was a sense of purpose, a final push toward justice. Jeff stood beside him, his face serious as he scanned the room. "You ready for this?" he asked quietly. Thomas nodded. "It's time." Together, they moved toward the podium, the noise in the room rising as the reporters noticed their presence. Thomas adjusted his tie, straightening his back as he approached the microphone. For a moment, the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on him, but he shook it off. He had come too far to falter now. "Good evening," Thomas began, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "I stand before you today not as a politician, but as a man who has spent the last 15 years searching for answers. Answers that were deliberately hidden from me, from my family, and from the public." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. He glanced at the cameras, knowing that millions were watching this moment unfold. For those of you who may not know, my wife, Amelia Wells, disappeared 15 years ago under mysterious circumstances. For years, I believed she was dead. But recently, I uncovered the truth. She was not dead. She was forced into hiding by a conspiracy led by a man many of you know, Martin Hale. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The name Martin Hale carried weight. People had heard rumors, whispers of his underhanded tactics, but no one had ever connected him to something like this. "Hale orchestrated my wife's disappearance," Thomas continued, his voice growing firmer. "He did this to weaken me politically, to destroy my career, and to ensure his own power. But the conspiracy didn't end with Amelia. He and his associates covered up her disappearance, hid my daughter's true identity, and threatened my family's safety for years." Thomas's words hung in the air, the weight of the revelation pressing down on everyone in the room. The reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing, but no one interrupted. They were waiting for the story to fully unfold. "Over the past few months," Thomas went on, "I have worked with investigators and journalists to gather the evidence needed to expose Hale's corruption. Today, I am releasing everything. Documents, witness statements, and records that will show just how deep this conspiracy goes. He gestured to Jeff, who stepped forward and handed out files to the reporters. The room buzzed with activity as the journalists flipped through the evidence, their expressions shifting from shock to disbelief. Thomas could see the storm brewing. Once this story broke, it would tear through Washington like a hurricane, sweeping away everyone complicit in Hale's schemes. But the cost of this moment weighed heavily on Thomas. Exposing Hale meant exposing his family's darkest secrets to the world. Rachel's true identity, Amelia's years in hiding, everything. He had wrestled with the decision for weeks, but in the end, there had been no choice. The truth had to come out, no matter the personal toll. As the reporters began asking questions, Thomas held up his hand, signaling for quiet. "I want to make one thing clear," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't just about politics. This is about justice. My family, my wife, my daughter, deserve to live without fear, without the shadow of Hale looming over them. And the people of this country deserve to know the truth." The room erupted with questions, the reporters shouting over one another in their scramble for details. But before Thomas could answer, Jeff's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face tightening. "Thomas," he said quietly, pulling him aside, "Hale's gone." Thomas frowned, his heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean, gone?" "Hale's people must have tipped him off. He disappeared before the story broke. They're looking for him now, but no one knows where he is." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Thomas had expected a fight, expected Hale to deny everything, to use his influence and power to push back. But disappear? That wasn't what he had anticipated. Thomas turned back to the podium, his mind racing. Hale was running. The coward. He had thought himself untouchable, but now that the truth was out, he had fled. Thomas felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and frustration. Hale wouldn't be there to answer for his crimes. Not yet, anyway. But his empire was crumbling. As the press conference continued, Thomas's phone buzzed. It was Rachel. He stepped away from the crowd, answering the call with a knot of anxiety in his chest. "Dad," Rachel's voice came through, soft but steady. "I saw the press conference. I just wanted to say thank you." Thomas leaned against the wall, his chest tightening. "For what?" "For everything," Rachel said quietly. "For telling the truth. For finding Mom. For fighting for us." Thomas closed his eyes, the weight of her words washing over him. He had spent so long fearing that the truth would destroy their fragile relationship, but now, hearing the strength in her voice, he knew that he had made the right choice. "Rachel," he said softly, "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. I never wanted you to." "It's okay," she interrupted, her voice gentle. "It's not your fault. We'll figure it out together." Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes, his heart swelling with emotion. "I love you, Rachel. I love you too, Dad." When the call ended, Thomas stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the emotions settle. He had spent years chasing the truth, fearing what it would mean for his family. But now that it was out, he realized something important. The truth had set them free. That evening, Thomas drove back to the cabin. The drive felt different this time, lighter, somehow. When he arrived, the cabin was bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. He stepped out of the car, his heart pounding as he approached the door. Amelia opened it before he could knock, her eyes red but her expression calm. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other, before she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Thomas held her tightly, feeling the years of pain and separation melt away. "I saw the news," Amelia whispered. "It's over, isn't it?" Thomas nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "It's over. He's gone." Amelia pulled back slightly, looking up at him. "And Rachel? She knows everything now. She's ready to meet you." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes as she smiled, her lips trembling. "I never thought this day would come." Thomas kissed her forehead, holding her close. "We have a lot to rebuild, but we're together now. That's all that matters." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in twilight, Thomas felt a sense of peace wash over him. The battle with Hale wasn't fully over. There would still be fallout, still be challenges ahead, but the worst was behind them. For the first time in years, Thomas could look to the future with hope. And for the first time in years, he wasn't running from the past. He had faced it, exposed the lies, and found his family again. The truth, once a burden he feared, had become the light that led them home.